let's cover how to combine impairment ratings. So what does that mean, combine? Well, why do we combine and what does it mean? Well, we do not add. First of all, be aware when you give an impairment rating, it should always be given as a whole person number, a whole person number. Now, if you're dealing with the addition 5 or 6 table, anytime you're typically dealing with the tables, you're dealing with whole person numbers. However, you need to be aware when you go to an extremity, there'll be partial numbers. And with partial numbers, they'll have you add partial numbers. And then as an example, let's say you're looking at the shoulder and there's 3 different ranges of motion that have been decreased in the shoulder. Those will individually be partial numbers. And then you'll add partial numbers, and then you'll convert that over into a whole person. So whole person's the number we always want to. And by the way, we'll go into some of the common extremities with the impairments also. But when you have more than one impairment rating, let's say you have a neck and a low back, you always want it in whole person. And then you always want to give the final product. So in a narrative report, you will give the cervical impairment rating, and then you'll give the lumbar impairment rating. But then you need to finish it out. You always finish with one number, and that one number should be a whole person number. And how we get to it is through the combined charts. These charts are in the back of the AMA guides. So if you don't have and by the way, you should have an edition of the AMA guides if you're going to be doing personal injury. So all we're going to do, what's the reasoning behind combined charts? Well, it's so you can never reach 100. That's the reasoning, because if you reach 100, you're dead. So what they do with combining is they created these charts. And so as the impairment numbers get higher, when you start combining 2 numbers, they'll start subtracting more and more numbers the higher you get, so you'll never reach 100. So that's what the combining is about. So just be aware in the AMA impairments, when we say combining, it's a very different meaning than adding. And there's a very different meaning between whole person or a partial, okay? So just be aware of that. So we always want to finish with whole person and a final number that's been combined, okay? So as an example, let's say you had 2 impairment ratings. What you do is you always just start with the biggest number. You go from the largest number to the second largest number to the third largest number to the fourth, if you had, 3, 4 different impairment ratings. So let's say you had a neck and low back, and we'll use this combined chart here and say let's say your neck was 25. So we'll come over here to 25 on the left-hand side going down. So we'll come over to 25. Now, let's say the impairment for the low back was 5. So we're going to come over at the bottom of the chart. You'll see you're going down left to right. You'll see 5. So come up the chart from 5, come on from 25, and you'll see right there it's 29. See, if you added it, it would be 30. It wouldn't be 29. So that's why it's not going to be, when you see 25 and 5, it's not going to be 30. That's why. So just be aware. So let's say I had 3. So let's say I had a 20% impairment rating for the neck, and let's say I had a 10% impairment rating for the low back, and let's say I ended up with a 5% for the extremity. So I had 20, 10, and 5. So I'm going to go with 20. Here's 20. My next number I want to do is 10. So I'm going to come over to 10, come all the way up to where it reached 20. There's 20, so that's 28. So now I'm going to come over to 28. I'm going to start over. I'm going to come over to 28, and my next number was 5. So I'm going to come over to 5, come up to 28, which is 32. 32. So see, in this case, it eliminated 3 whole person impairment points relative to adding. Now, the only other caveat you need to be aware of is, remember, in the secondary findings in the neck and the low back, we looked at lordosis. In the neck, we looked at lordosis and the physiological line of stress. And in the low back, we paid attention to lordosis. Well, remember, in the range of motion category, we were allowed to add 1% per finding in addition to whatever impairment rating we found with the neck. So let's just stick with the neck for a second. And let's say the physiological line of stress was positive and the lordosis was positive. And let's say the neck had an LMSI, and we're going to say it's 25% impairment rating. So we would go to 25, but remember, when we add the range of motion findings, if you recall in the table we looked at, it said specifically to add it and not combine it. So you get 100% of that full number. So in this case, it would just be 25 plus 1 plus 1. Remember, if you remember, it was one whole person per structural finding. So if it was 25 for MSI and we had abnormal physiological line of stress and we had pathological lordosis, so that's 1 and 1. So it'd be 25, 26, 27. In that case, since we're using the secondary findings of the range of motion, we would add 1% whole person, not combine. So in conclusion, the combining chart is used so you never get to 100% because it's death. And if you have more than one impairment area like the neck and low back, then we are going to want to combine them. So that's how. And we'll go into what it looks like, but essentially in the how is it presented? So all you would have is under the impairment heading of your narrative report, you would just list the source of your impairment. So it'd be the AMA guides, what edition, and then what page and what table. You'd list the source. Then let's say you had 2. Then you would list the table for the neck. Let's say it was the neck and low back. Then you'd list the table for the neck. You'd list the table for the low back. And then you'd list those impairment ratings individually. And then at the bottom, in other words, it's like a big funnel going to narrow funnel. Then at the bottom, we would combine both of those and we'd give one final number, one final whole person number for that patient. That's the flow of what it would look like. So the heading would be the impairment rating, and then it would be what was the source, your addition, what page, what table. List the impairment rating. If you have more than one, then list the second page and table and page. If you have 3, then list the third page and table. So now you've got each of the individual and whole person impairment ratings, then combine them to give you one final number. That's how it would be presented, and it's under the impairment index of the narrative, or excuse me, the impairment rating title in the narrative report finding. But that's how it would be presented.